Dr. Greetje Witte Rang is a theologian and researcher on ecumenism, economy and peace. She worked as a study secretary on war, peace and reformed churches, geeft nu de kerken, and as a researcher at Oikos. She's active within the Council of Churches, Platform Sustainable and Solidary Economy, and the Society, Church and Peace. We are very glad that you would so cordially accept our invitation to speak today, Greetje. We are very glad that you are here and eager what you want us to listen to tell us. Thank you very much.
It's an honor for me to be invited here to speak at this symposium and to do so in the presence of a theologian as important as Stanley Hauerwas. I'm asked to reflect on the challenges of Hauerwas for the work for peace. And I will do so in 5 points, but let me first tell you how I came to know the work of Hauerwas. After I finished my theological study here in Kampen at the other university, I was for some years study secretary in my church, the Gereformeerde Kerk in Nederland, on the issues of war and peace. But during my study I had become member of a small organization called Church and Peace, a pacifist organization, member of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, IFOR. At the moment, I'm secretary of its theological working group. Church and Peace is the oldest still existing peace organization in the Netherlands. It was founded in 1924 by mainly theologians. In the churches, however, membership was sharply criticized. In 1936, my own church condemned the anti-militaristic rejection of war in every form as incompatible with Scripture. It did so without any real analysis of the political situation. It was merely a matter of principles. In the same sentence, the Synod rejected the principles of leadership and totalitarian state of the Nazi ideology. What made this extra painful was that most members of Church and Peace were early and sharp critics of the Nazi ideology. This rejection of pacifism of my church was softened over the years, but it shows that in the Reformed tradition this issue is a complicated one, and it still is. The Christian Unie, the small Orthodox Christian party in Parliament, is a critical party vis-à-vis the structures of society, with one exception, the issue of violence. That is why Church and Peace asked to meet representatives of the Christian Unie last year. It was a good meeting, but the difference on this specific issue remained. The just war concept is supported, and Bonhoeffer was said to be the example that pacifism won't do. We hope to continue this dialogue. But back to the way I got acquainted with Hauerwas. As an organization with members in Mennonite and other more liberal churches, Church and Peace hardly has any members in the smaller Reformed and in the evangelical churches. With regard to the last, it's a problem that most members of Church and Peace are elderly people. To be honest, I belong to the younger generation and I'm nearly 62. So we decided that to contact younger people from Orthodox and evangelical churches. Many of them are inspired by Hauerwas. At the same time, we wanted to study the concept of being a peace church. Someone mentioned the book Een Robuuste Kerk with articles by Hauerwas. In these 2 ways, I came to know Hauerwas' work very late indeed, and I enjoyed it. It's a fresh, original, creative and critical way of theological and ethical thinking. It stimulates self-reflection, I realized I'm much more influenced by our liberal and individualistic culture than I hoped. Then I come to the challenges in the work of Hauerwas. There's one quote by Hauerwas that made me a fan in one instance. In my eyes, this quote contains much of his thinking in a nutshell. That is where he says that he always tells people he's a pacifist, and where he explains why he does so. That's not because he thinks of himself he is such a humble and peaceful person. On the contrary, he knows he is violent in his words, and that he, being a smart man, uses his intelligence as a weapon. He knows himself, and by telling people he's a pacifist, he creates expectations, and he hopes that people will remind him of what he said and will help him to stay on that road. In the rest of my presentation, I will explain why this quote is so important. First point, we should not use ahistorical principles. One of the reasons why Hauerwas is such a stimulating theologian is that he pulls us into a narrative, in a learning communion, and confronts us with real present-day reality. We are called to live the gospel in daily life, and with stories, Hauerwas illustrates what he means. That's something else than applying a set of principles to distinguish right from wrong. I think that this is where my church was wrong in its rejection of pacifism. It applied principles and texts not related to history or to the narrative of the Bible, nor to the life of the church. Second point, we need the community to see ourselves clearly. We need other people to become and to stay who we are meant to be. By taking that as a starting point, Hauerwas ends up with ideas that are fresh, creative, and highly critical towards the common way of thinking we all often fall victim to. For example, when he discusses the issue of abortion. Taking the Christian community as a starting point in these debates results in a much more fruitful reflection than starting with the idea of life as an absolute good in itself, which is not even a Christian idea, according to Hauerwas. We have much to learn here. Our churches, and I think that also applies for more orthodox churches than mine, are under the influence of a culture of individualism, privatization, and consumerism. For example, to discover lifestyles is very difficult. People are defensive, they're afraid of being lectured about what to do and what to refrain from. We want to be our own church. Only other people can reveal that we deceive ourselves. So we need each other and our careful study of Bible and society to show us who we really are and what is asked of us. This is also helpful in other relations. We can't judge for ourselves whether racism exists in our society or whether we are racist ourselves instead of listening to the ones who feel discriminated. On a worldwide scale, we see ourselves as a nation that is peaceful, charitable, and just, but we forget that we are in the top 10 of arms exporters, that we offer shelter to companies that avoid paying taxes, that our economy and our lifestyle are devastating for many. We need others to see ourselves clearly. As churches, we have many opportunities to hear the voices of people that are seldom heard. We only have to listen. And that implies also listen to understand why others see us as their enemies. Third point, a pacifist does not underestimate the power of sin. One of the misunderstandings in relation to pacifists is that they are convinced that deep in their hearts all human beings are peaceful and kind, and that we should only dig this up to create a better world. That is not the case. Most pacifists are, like Hauerwas, well aware of the violence we are all using and capable of. Our fundamental sin is, according to Hauerwas, the attempt to overreach our power as creatures. We want to be in control, and we use force to maintain the illusion that we are. And very important, in contrast with many Christians, Hauerwas is not selective in his criticism of our culture. When he speaks of the necessity of living a counterculture, he not only refers to issues like sexual relations or euthanasia, but also to the environment, injustice, violence, and poverty. Hauerwas says the church teaches us to acknowledge how much we are sinners. Sin has to be taught because it's not a natural category. Sin is self-deception. You do not make yourself popular nowadays by using that kind of words. As part of the liturgy in many churches, confession of guilt is neglected or even abolished. Of course, it has become a ritual without any real content in many situations. But we need to reflect our conduct, to discover our self-deceit. That is why we shouldn't have any illusions about so-called just wars. In our self-deception, we always claim our wars to be just. But in each war, people are tortured and raped. By both parties, whether or not our newspapers report it. The official reasons for violent interventions are seldom the real reasons. The late Hannes de Graaf, one of the great thinkers of Church and Peace, once said, "The justification of violence is worse than the use of violence itself. To justify ourselves, we have to dehumanize and demonize our enemies, and by doing so, we comfortably diminish the challenge we face in using violence." Third point. The world is entitled to church. Pacifism is not, as many think, being passive in situations of injustice and violence. On the contrary, peacemaking obliges us to become intensely interested in politics and to study and practice ways of handling conflicts. But we do so in our own way as followers of Jesus, not by coercion and violence. According to Hauerwas, what makes the church church is its faithful manifestation of the peaceable kingdom in the world. The church fails the world by not showing it alive and a community of peacemaking. As the late Dutch theologian Bertus said, the world is entitled to church. Hannes de Graaf writes that the Sermon on the Mount teaches the church to be thoughtful of a way of fulfilling the law that is deemed impossible by common moral. The church should cultivate the virtues this sermon asks for. Here Hauerwas speaks of imaginative power. The church offers the world a new possibility by being a different kind of people. De Graaf gives in his book on the Sermon of the Mount an impressive example of such a possibility even in a concentration camp. We should take the time in our churches to study, reflect and practice this. In a pamphlet, Church and Peace, published last year, we said, we see pacifism as a space and a time for reflection, for deeper analysis of the causes and the effects of violence. Over the last years, our country has entered into wars that caused disasters because our government did not take the time to consider who we are, our motives, our behavior worldwide, and what the effects of our violent intervention would be and what alternative we have. No, the leading idea was we have to do something, and that something often results in declaring war, because that is something we are acquainted with. The world needs the experiences of communities that practice non-violent conflict resolution. Fifth point, and last point. A pacifist is very well informed of the ways of the world. More than once, a representative of Pax, where Pax is a merger of Pax Christi and the Interchurch Peace Council, started their articles with the assurance there are no pacifists. Why? I fear it's for the same reason why this organization chose to hide its family name, Christi. It seems they want to make clear from the start that it's not because they are pacifists or Christians that they are reluctant to use violence, but because they are good political analysts. A pacifist is, so they seem to think, by definition, not very well acquainted with the ways of the world. But that is not the pacifism that Hauerwas represents. He says, non-violence is the necessary condition for a politics not based on death. Pacifists understand very well what is going on in the world, and that's precisely why they try to resist the temptation of using the language and arguments of others to be accepted as a serious discussion partner. In his articles on several issues, Hauerwas proves he's very well informed, but he does not agree. In many ways, Hauerwas is countercultural. That's an important reminder for us who often feel too much at home in our comfortable society. Nowadays, politicians ask the church to help defending our Christian values, thinking the church is their ally. But they have no idea what these values are and imply, and that the disciples of Christ are not the natural allies of the state. The only argument our Prime Minister could give for joining other countries in the bombing of Syria was that the terrorists oppose our way of living. That is similar to what Hauerwas noticed after 9/11, the contrast between the willingness to die for their cause on the side of the terrorists and the call of the American government to go on shopping. Indeed, in our societies, the vision of what really matters has disappeared from the public debate, with the result that people are lost in the confrontation with misguiding leaders like Trump and wilden. In my view, the church is no ally in the rejection of radical thinking. We have to ask ourselves what our answer would be if we, like the Muslims, were asked to become moderate believers. Is in fact not our problem that we are moderate believers. As Christians, we are resident aliens whose community is the church. As churches, we should reflect much more on what that implies. And I thank Hauerwas for the challenge he presents us.